Captain Jake Morrison's boots echoed in the massive Galactic Council chambers as he watched the holographic display flicker to life for the third time that day. The image showed Ambassador Kethera, her tall blue form trembling as explosions lit up the sky behind her. Her people, the Zilani, were known throughout the galaxy for their peaceful nature and incredible artistic abilities. Now their beautiful crystal cities were crumbling under enemy fire. "Please, honored council members," Kethera's voice cracked with desperation. "The Vorthan Empire has surrounded our entire star system. Their war fleets block every escape route. In 72 hours, they will begin destroying our cities from orbit. We don't ask for much. Just medical supplies for our wounded. Maybe someone who can talk to them, convince them to stop." Jake felt his jaw clench as he watched children running through burning streets on the hologram. The Zilani had never hurt anyone. They spent their time creating beautiful music and sculptures that amazed visitors from across the galaxy. They didn't even have a proper military, just a small patrol force to help lost travelers. Around the circular chamber, representatives from dozens of alien species sat in their floating chairs. The Bruges delegate, who looked like a massive elephant with 6 arms, was whispering to his aide. His trunk swayed nervously as he spoke about bad timing and unfortunate circumstances. The Nexari representative, a being made entirely of living crystal that sparkled in the chamber's light, raised one of her sharp appendages. "Perhaps we could send peace negotiators," she suggested in her musical voice. "Surely the Vorthans can be reasoned with." Speaker Prime, the insectoid leader who ran these meetings, clicked his 4 mandibles together thoughtfully. His compound eyes reflected the hologram's light as he considered options. "Yes, we could establish humanitarian corridors. Safe passages for civilians to evacuate. This has worked before." Jake had been quiet long enough. He stood up from Earth's delegation seat, his human voice cutting through the gentle murmur of alien languages. "What about sending military support?" The enormous chamber went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the polished floor. Hundreds of alien eyes turned to stare at the human representative. Some looked shocked, others disgusted, a few seemed genuinely confused. The silence stretched on until the Bruges delegate's trunk curled in what Jake recognized as their version of a sneer. "Absolutely impossible," he declared, his 6 arms gesturing dramatically. "The Galactic Warfare Convention strictly prohibits military intervention in territorial disputes. We are civilized beings, not barbarians." Jake felt heat rising in his chest. On the hologram, another Zilani city was burning. "The Zilani will be completely wiped out in less than a week," he said, trying to keep his voice level. Speaker Prime's mandibles clicked in that disapproving way Jake had learned to hate during his 2 years on this council. "Violence only creates more violence, human. This is why your species struggles to understand our ways. We solve problems through talking, through understanding, through peaceful means. War is the tool of primitive minds." Other delegates nodded their various heads, tentacles, and sensory organs in agreement. The Quillian representative, who looked like a giant porcupine, spoke up. "The humans always think fighting is the answer. This is why they have so much trouble on their own world." Jake looked around the chamber at all these civilized aliens who were content to let an entire peaceful species get murdered while they sent strongly worded letters and medical bandages. His hands were shaking slightly as he thought about the Zilani children he'd seen on that transmission. The vote was called quickly. Medical supplies and diplomatic envoys only. Every single alien species voted yes. When it came to Earth's turn, Jake wanted to scream, to flip over tables, to make them understand that sometimes talking wasn't enough. Instead, he took a deep breath and cast Earth's vote with the majority. "Earth agrees," he said quietly. The session ended with polite applause and self-congratulations. Delegates filed out chatting about lunch plans and upcoming cultural exchanges while an entire civilization faced extinction. Jake walked slowly back to Earth's embassy building, his mind racing. 2 hours later, he was in a secure communication room, typing out an encrypted message on quantum channels that no alien government could intercept. Admiral Beth Rodriguez was having dinner with her family when her personal communicator buzzed with the highest priority signal. She read Jake's message twice, kissed her husband goodbye, and headed for fleet headquarters. By midnight, while the Galactic Council slept peacefully in their beds, every human warship in the sector was moving at maximum speed towards Zalani space. Earth hadn't broken any promises. They had voted for medical supplies and diplomats, and those were being sent too. Jake had simply forgotten to mention that Earth was also sending something else entirely. Admiral Beth Rodriguez gripped the armrest of her command chair as the human fleet sensors painted a picture of absolute horror. Space around the beautiful blue-green world of Zelania looked like a nightmare come to life. Massive Vorthan warships, each one the size of a small city, hung in orbit like vultures. Bright orange plasma beams lanced down from their weapons, turning peaceful Zalani settlements into smoking craters. The tactical display showed dozens of smaller Vorthan attack craft swooping through the atmosphere like deadly insects. They were hunting refugee convoys, families trying to escape in whatever vehicles they could find. Beth watched helplessly as energy blasts vaporized civilian transports one after another. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Danny Foster from the communications station. His young face had gone pale as he monitored Zalani emergency frequencies. "Admiral, they're targeting schools and hospitals specifically. The Vorthans aren't just conquering this place, they're trying to wipe out every living Zalani." Beth had been in the military for 25 years. She'd seen combat in the Martian colonies and fought pirates in the outer asteroid belt. But this was different. This was genocide happening right in front of her eyes, and she had the power to stop it. "All ships, this is Admiral Rodriguez," she announced over the fleet channel. "Weapons are authorized. Primary targets are any Vorthan vessel currently firing on civilians. Secondary targets are anything else with a Vorthan flag. Rules of engagement are simple: protect innocent lives at all costs." Commander Tony Park, her tactical officer, looked up from his station with concern. "Admiral, shouldn't we try to contact them first? Maybe demand they cease fire and withdraw? That's standard protocol for intervention operations." Beth stared at the tactical screen where another civilian transport had just been destroyed, taking probably 50 Zalani families with it. She could see the bright flashes of plasma fire still raining down on cities where millions of peaceful aliens were hiding in whatever shelters they could find. "They're slaughtering children, Tony. Here's my diplomatic message." Her fingers slammed down on the fleet firing authorization button. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for generations. The human fleet didn't announce their presence with polite radio messages. They didn't request meetings with Vorthan commanders or try to establish communication channels. They simply opened fire with every weapon they had. Human railguns, designed for ship-to-ship combat in the brutal environment of space, hammered into Vorthan shields with devastating effect. These weren't the gentle energy exchanges that most galactic species used in their rare conflicts. These were solid tungsten projectiles moving at 20% of light speed, carrying more kinetic energy than most alien weapons could produce. The Vorthans had been expecting what they always encountered: civilized species that fought according to rules. Their shields were calibrated for the polite warfare typical throughout the galaxy, where opponents took turns firing and gave each other chances to surrender honorably. They weren't ready for humans who came in shooting and didn't stop. Captain Amy Chen, commanding the destroyer New York, watched her target, a massive Vorthan cruiser, as it tried to turn away from the fight. Its captain was probably following standard galactic procedure, attempting to withdraw to a safe distance where negotiations could begin. "Negative on that withdrawal," Amy announced to her bridge crew. Her voice was cold as Arctic ice. They had 72 hours to leave peacefully. They chose to stay and murder civilians instead. The New York's missiles streaked across space, their guidance systems locked onto the fleeing Vorthan ship. The cruiser's captain probably couldn't believe what was happening. In galactic warfare, you didn't shoot at retreating vessels. You let them go and then had diplomatic meetings about terms. But Amy Chen wasn't interested in galactic warfare rules. The explosion lit up her view screen as the Vorthan cruiser broke apart. All across the battle zone, similar scenes played out. Human ships moved with deadly precision, targeting Vorthan vessels based on one simple principle: if it was shooting at civilians, it died. The Vorthans, who had been casually bombarding cities like they were playing some kind of game, suddenly found themselves in the fight of their lives. Captain Rick Thompson, commanding the battleship Texas, coordinated the assault on the largest Vorthan dreadnought. All batteries, focus fire on that flagship. Someone in there gave the order to target those schools. The massive Vorthan ship tried to raise its shields higher and return fire, but human tactics were unlike anything they'd faced. Instead of the usual long-range energy duels, human ships closed to knife-fighting range, their armor absorbing hits while their weapons tore through Vorthan defenses. Down on the planet's surface, something unprecedented was happening. Zilani families emerged from burned-out shelters and underground bunkers to witness a sight none of them had ever imagined. The terrifying Vorthan fleet that had been methodically destroying their world was now fleeing in complete panic from ships marked with Earth's blue and white insignia. Children who had been crying in fear just minutes ago now pointed at the sky in wonder as Vorthan attack craft streaked away from the atmosphere, chased by human fighters that pursued them without mercy. Elder Kessala, one of the Zilani's most respected leaders, stood in the ruins of her city's council chamber and watched the battle through a crack in the collapsed roof. In all our histories, she whispered to her aide, we have never seen anyone fight like this. These humans, they fight as if our children were their own children. The battle was over in less than 4 hours. The mighty Vorthan fleet that had terrorized the Zilani for weeks was either destroyed or fleeing toward the edge of the star system. And for the first time since the crisis began, Zilani emergency broadcasts carried a message of hope instead of despair. The Galactic Council chamber had never seen chaos like this before. Representatives from dozens of species were shouting in their various languages, their translators struggling to keep up with the flood of angry words. Emergency session lights bathed everything in harsh red as holographic displays showed real-time footage of human warships hunting down fleeing Vorthan vessels across 3 different star systems. The Bruges ambassador was so furious his 6 arms were waving wildly, his massive trunk curled in rage. This is absolutely unacceptable, he bellowed, spittle flying from his mouth. Human forces must be recalled immediately. They have violated 17 separate articles of the Galactic Warfare Convention, maybe more. This is barbarism of the highest order. Ambassador Zelnara from the Crystal Beings was practically vibrating with indignation, her translucent body flashing angry red colors. They're chasing down retreating ships. Retreating ships, for stars' sake. Even primitive civilizations understand that you don't shoot at vessels trying to withdraw from combat. Jake Morrison sat calmly in Earth's delegation chair while alien voices screamed around him. His hands were folded in his lap, and he appeared completely unbothered by the storm of accusations being hurled at his species. When the shouting died down enough for him to be heard, he spoke in a quiet, steady voice. Which convention are you referring to exactly? The question seemed to stun the chamber into momentary silence. The Bruges ambassador's trunk twitched as if Jake had asked something incredibly stupid. The Galactic Warfare Convention of 2387, of course. The foundational document that governs how all civilized species conduct military operations. Every member of this council signed it. Jake nodded thoughtfully, as if he was considering this information for the first time. That's interesting. Earth never signed that convention. What? The word came out as a shocked whisper from Speaker Prime, his compound eyes reflecting his disbelief. We weren't invited to that particular meeting, Jake continued with the same calm tone. In fact, most galactic species were still referring to humans as those violent primitives from the Outer Rim back in 2387. Nobody thought to ask our opinion about rules of war. The holographic displays around the chamber continued showing footage that was making several alien delegates physically sick. Human ships were methodically hunting down every Vorthan vessel that had participated in the attack on Zilania. There were no truces, no ceasefires, no polite requests for surrender. The humans were treating this like what it actually was, a war. Captain Danny Foster's voice crackled through the communication system from the bridge of his destroyer, Vorthan cruiser attempting to reach hyperspace jump point. Permission to intercept. Admiral Beth Rodriguez's reply was broadcast for the entire council to hear, granted. These ships were bombing hospitals 6 hours ago. They don't get to run home and pretend this never happened. The Nexary representative made a sound like breaking glass, which her translator rendered as horrified sobbing. They're not following any of the established protocols. Where are the negotiation periods? The formal challenges? The opportunity for honorable withdrawal? Jake looked around the chamber at faces filled with shock and disgust. These beings had spent centuries developing elaborate rules for how to conduct warfare in the most civilized way possible. Wars were supposed to be polite affairs with clear boundaries, regular breaks for diplomatic discussions, and plenty of opportunities for both sides to save face. You want to know why we don't follow your warfare convention? Jake asked. Because your rules are designed to protect the attackers, not the victims. Commander Tony Park's voice came through the speakers next, reporting from a human landing force on one of the Vorthan military bases. We've secured the command center. Intelligence shows they were planning to move against the Quillian colonies next, then the Minari system. This wasn't a territorial dispute, it was the beginning of a campaign to wipe out every peaceful species in this sector. The chamber fell silent as that information sank in. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ambassador Kethera, the Zalani representative, had been quiet throughout the heated exchanges. Now she stood slowly, her blue skin still showing scars from when her own embassy had been attacked. Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the sudden quiet. In one day, she said, the humans accomplished what we believed was impossible. The siege that would have destroyed my people completely is broken. Our children are safe. Our cities will be rebuilt. The Quillian delegate, whose species had apparently been next on the Vorthan target list, spoke up with a trembling voice. But at what cost? Look at those tactical feeds. Human soldiers are storming Vorthan positions with terrifying efficiency. This isn't warfare as we understand it. Jake leaned forward in his chair, his eyes hard. The cost of doing what's right. Your civilized warfare convention would have let the Vorthans massacre every Zalani while you spent months negotiating about proper protocols and honorable surrender terms. Admiral Rodriguez's voice cut through the discussion one more time. Council can complain all they want about our methods. We're not stopping until every Vorthan weapon pointed at innocent civilians is turned to scrap metal. They wanted to play extermination games, now they get to learn what happens when someone fights back without rules. The holographic displays showed human marines working alongside freed prisoners from a dozen different species, all of them people who had been scheduled for elimination under Vorthan expansion plans. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the chamber. The uncivilized humans were saving lives that the civilized galactic community had been willing to sacrifice for the sake of proper diplomatic procedure. Jake stood up from his chair and looked around the chamber one final time. Maybe it's time to ask yourselves why your rules of war seem designed to help aggressors get away with genocide. The message came through on all frequencies, broadcast from the Vorthan High Command directly to Admiral Beth Rodriguez's flagship. The Vorthan Supreme Commander, a being whose species looked like oversized lizards with too many teeth, appeared on the holographic display wearing his most impressive ceremonial armor. His voice carried the arrogant tone of someone who had never truly been challenged. Human Fleet Commander, he began, the Vorthan Empire recognizes your unexpected capabilities. We are prepared to offer terms for an honorable cessation of hostilities. In exchange for your withdrawal from Zalani space, we will consider reparations for damages caused during our recent operations. The bridge of Rodriguez's flagship went quiet. Officers looked at each other in disbelief. After everything they had seen, after the hospitals bombed and the refugee convoys destroyed, the Vorthans were talking about operations and expecting to negotiate their way out of consequences. Admiral Rodriguez stood slowly and walked to the communication console. Her response would be recorded and broadcast across every inhabited system in the galaxy, becoming one of the most famous military transmissions in history. Surrender. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. That's interesting. You didn't seem interested in accepting Zalani's surrender when you were bombing their cities. Here's my counter-proposal, Supreme Commander. We stop shooting when you're no longer capable of threatening innocent people. Not 1 minute before. The Vorthan commander's reptilian eyes widened in shock. In his entire career, no one had ever refused his surrender offers. The transmission cut off abruptly as human fleets began moving deeper into Vorthan space. What followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human warships poured across the Vorthan border like a flood of steel and fury. They didn't stop to garrison captured worlds or establish occupation zones. They moved with singular purpose, systematically hunting down every Vorthan military asset they could find. General Rick Thompson commanded the ground forces, and his approach was methodical and terrifying to watch. His troops didn't just capture Vorthan military bases, they turned them inside out looking for evidence. Every computer was copied, every file was downloaded, every record was preserved. Colonel Kate Wilson reporting from the Vorthan 4th Fleet headquarters, came one transmission. We've cracked their central archives. The evidence we're finding here it's worse than we thought. Lieutenant Jake Foster, a young intelligence officer barely out of training, had gone pale as he scrolled through captured Vorthan files. Colonel, they weren't just planning to destroy the Zalani. This was phase 1 of something they called the Great Cleansing. They had lists, ma'am. Target lists for 47 different species. Wilson felt sick as she read over his shoulder. The Vorthans had planned out the systematic elimination of every peaceful species in 3 sectors of space. The attack on the Zalani wasn't random cruelty, it was the beginning of the largest genocide attempt in galactic history. Document everything, Wilson ordered, her voice tight with controlled anger. Every name, every date, every planned attack. The galaxy needs to see what these monsters really are. The psychological impact on the Vorthan Empire was devastating. For over 3 centuries, they had built their power on a simple principle: attack peaceful species knowing that the galactic community would eventually negotiate a settlement rather than fight a real war. They had counted on civilized beings being unwilling to pay the cost of total victory. But humans weren't playing by those rules. When Vorthan fleets tried to retreat and regroup, human ships followed them. When Vorthan commanders attempted to establish defensive positions, human forces simply went around them and attacked their supply lines. When Vorthan diplomats tried to open communication channels, they found that humans weren't interested in talking. Captain Amy Chen, commanding the battleship Determination, was pursuing a fleeing Vorthan battle group when she opened a channel to broadcast her message directly to their ships. "This is Captain Chen of the human vessel Determination," her voice echoed across space. "You spent decades hunting the defenseless. You targeted schools and hospitals because you thought no one would make you pay for it. Well, congratulations. You found someone who will." Her weapons lit up the darkness as another Vorthan cruiser disappeared in a ball of fire. The most shocking discoveries came from the liberated worlds behind human lines. As Vorthan forces fled or were destroyed, the truth about their empire became clear. They hadn't just conquered other species, they had turned them into slaves. Dozens of different alien races had been working in Vorthan factories and mines, building the very weapons that were supposed to be used to exterminate their cousins. Captain Danny Park was on one of these worlds when the Vorthan guards fled. He watched in amazement as thousands of aliens emerged from underground facilities, blinking in sunlight many hadn't seen in years. "I don't understand," said Veltar, a member of the gentle Quillan species, as human medics treated his injuries. "Why do you fight so hard for people you've never met? Your species barely knows ours exists." Danny looked around at the crowds of freed slaves, representing species from across the galaxy. "Because somebody has to," he said simply. "And apparently, we're the only ones crazy enough to do it." Word spread through Vorthan space like wildfire. The mighty empire that had terrorized the galaxy for generations was crumbling before an enemy that refused to follow the rules. Vorthan military units began surrendering without fighting. Their subject races started rebelling. Planets that had been conquered decades ago suddenly declared independence, knowing that the humans would protect them if the Vorthans tried to retaliate. Admiral Rodriguez watched the tactical displays showing Vorthan territory dissolving into chaos and felt a grim satisfaction. They built their power on fear, she told her staff. Let's see how they like being afraid for a change. The transmission that ended the war came from Vorthan Prime itself, broadcast from the ruins of what had once been the most feared military command center in the galaxy. Supreme Commander Haskath, his ceremonial armor cracked and his pride completely shattered, appeared on screens throughout known space to deliver words that no Vorthan leader had ever spoken before. The Vorthan Empire surrenders unconditionally to human forces, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We request immediate cessation of hostilities and await terms. The war had lasted exactly 6 weeks and 2 days. In that time, an empire that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries had been completely dismantled by a species most aliens still considered newcomers to galactic civilization. Every government in known space waited to see what humanity would do next. History was full of examples of what happened when a militaristic species achieved total victory. The conquered territory would be occupied, the defeated population enslaved, and a new empire would rise even more terrible than the last. It was the natural order of things. Admiral Beth Rodriguez stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the stars that no longer held any Vorthan military presence. Her officers were watching her carefully, waiting for orders about setting up occupation forces and military governors. The human fleet controlled 3 entire sectors of space now, with resources that could make Earth incredibly wealthy. Instead, she activated the fleet-wide communication system and delivered 4 words that stunned every person listening: mission accomplished. We're going home. Commander Tony Park looked up from his tactical station in complete confusion. Admiral, what about garrison forces? Someone needs to maintain order in former Vorthan space. There are supply lines to secure, governments to establish, prisoners to process. Beth smiled at her young officer. Tony, we came here to stop a genocide. The genocide is stopped. Our job is done. The news reached the Galactic Council chambers within hours, causing what one observer later described as the most chaotic emergency session in the organization's 1,000-year history. Representatives from dozens of species sat in stunned silence as they processed information that didn't make sense according to everything they understood about how wars ended. The Bruges ambassador was the first to find his voice. They're just leaving. All of human space is withdrawing. This is unprecedented in galactic history. What's their angle? Demanded the Nexary representative, her crystal body flashing suspicious colors. No species conquers 3 sectors and then simply walks away. What do the humans really want? Ambassador Jake Morrison stood slowly in Earth's delegation area. After 6 weeks of bitter fighting and heated council debates, he looked tired but satisfied. We want exactly what we said we wanted from the beginning. We wanted the Vorthans to stop committing genocide. They've stopped. We're done. The chamber erupted in confused voices speaking dozens of different languages. Speaker Prime had to call for order 3 times before the noise died down enough for anyone to be heard. But the occupied territories, the Quillian delegate protested. Former Vorthan space covers 47 star systems. Who will govern them? How will disputes be resolved? What about the military installations and weapons stockpiles? Jake looked around the chamber at faces that couldn't comprehend what they were hearing. The people who live in those systems will govern themselves. We're leaving behind monitoring stations to make sure no one else tries to restart the genocide program, and we're establishing war crimes tribunals so the people who suffered under Vorthan rule can get justice. Other than that, it's not our business. What humanity did leave behind became the stuff of legend. The Zilani received defensive shield technology that would protect their world from any future orbital bombardment. Medical equipment that could heal injuries the Zilani didn't even have words for. Communication arrays that would let them call for help instantly if anyone ever threatened them again. Importantly, none of the gifted technology had any offensive capabilities. No weapons, no warship designs, no military infrastructure. The humans had given their former enemies' victims the tools to protect themselves, but not the means to become aggressors themselves. Captain Rick Thompson was overseeing the final withdrawal from a former Vorthan slave processing center when one of the freed aliens approached him. Velnara was a Minari, one of the species that had been scheduled for elimination in the Vorthan expansion plan. "I don't understand your people," she admitted. "Every conqueror in galactic history has kept what they won. Why are you different?" Rick looked around at the thousands of freed slaves from dozens of different species, all of them people who were alive because humans had decided that genocide was unacceptable. "Because we didn't come here to conquer anybody. We came here to help." 3 months after the last human warship left former Vorthan space, the first real test of the new galactic order came. The Kethran Empire, another militaristic species known for aggressive expansion, began positioning fleets near the peaceful Minari colonies. Intelligence reports suggested they were planning the same kind of territorial acquisition that had once been common throughout the galaxy. But when Kethran military planners accessed their strategic databases, they found something that hadn't been there before. A new addition to standard Galactic Council protocols, added quietly after the Vorthan War. Section 847 Alpha, in cases of systematic civilian targeting, genocide, or unprovoked aggression against peaceful populations, immediate consultation with Terran Defense Forces is authorized. Human military intervention may proceed without Council approval under these circumstances. The Kethran fleets quietly withdrew to their own territory. Their expansion plans were permanently shelved. Jake Morrison stood before the Galactic Council for the final time in his role as Earth's ambassador. He was being reassigned to a diplomatic post in the outer colonies, where humanity was helping newly independent worlds establish their own governments. The faces looking at him were different now. The mixture of condescension and amusement that had once characterized how aliens viewed humans had been replaced by something else. Respect, certainly, but also a healthy dose of fear. 6 months ago, you asked Earth to provide support for a humanitarian crisis, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent chamber. We gave you something much more valuable. We gave you peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace that comes from negotiation and compromise, but the lasting peace that exists when bullies understand there will be consequences for their actions. As Jake gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Ambassador Kethera approached him quietly. The Zilani's blue skin had healed from her injuries, and her people were rebuilding their beautiful cities with human assistance. Your people called themselves uncivilized, she whispered, so only Jake could hear. Perhaps we are the ones who need to learn what true civilization looks like. Jake paused at the chamber door and looked back one final time at the collection of species that made up the galactic community. They were good people, most of them, but they had forgotten that sometimes protecting the innocent required more than good intentions and polite words. Maybe, he said quietly, civilization isn't about following rules. Maybe it's about knowing when to break them.